Okay, welcome to our keynote. So my name is Dave Schmitz. I'm in philosophy here at the University of Arizona, and I direct something called the Center for Philosophy of Freedom. My wife, Kathleen Johnson, was supposed to introduce Vernon Smith tonight, but her flight out of Charlotte got delayed, and her flight out of Dallas got canceled, so she won't be making it, I'm sorry to say. And she was so looking forward to being here with you and to the honor of chairing this session. Kate met Vernon Smith when her professor, Catherine Eckel, recommended her to Vernon's summer workshop here in Tucson in the summer of 2000. And that week was what she describes as, and I see some of the people who were here, that was a drinking from a fire hose rush of experiments and brainstorming. And Vernon followed up by inviting Kate to do a postdoc in Tucson. And Kate wanted me to stress that pipeline that Vernon helped and Catherine helped to create for her. It's an example of the doors that Vernon has a way of opening for so many people, and also a sign of how much Vernon has given and has been willing to invest in the field of experimental economics. So Kate says hanging out with scholars in Vernon's group, and again, like I said, I see some of them. She said it was just a dream, like a fantasy of what being an academic could be like. And I can second that because I had the same experience when I paused to get a master's degree in economics on the way to my PhD in philosophy. I would walk down the hallway and somebody like Kevin would stick his head out of his office and say, hey, Dave, can I buy you a cup of coffee? And I'd say, like, what's coffee? Anyway, he introduced me to it. But yeah, and several people from Vernon's team, we'd go out to coffee and say, Dave, you're a philosopher, so what's science? What's an experiment? What's a theory? I'm an experimental economist, but what does it mean to really be testable? What's a disconfirmation? Is there any such thing as a confirmation? So for 2 years, best time of my life, I spent it working as a research assistant in the economic science laboratory and hanging out in the economics department. So Kate says, and I concur, that Vernon's lab was a front row seat when it came to seeing what science is, what it could be, and how it's done when it's done right. So years later, Vernon and Candace remembered me well enough, incredibly to my mind, but they remembered me well enough to go out of their way to introduce me to Kate, and I married her a year later. And so in my house, there's a level of indebtedness that it goes beyond what you can put in words. It really does. But what Kate also observed about Vernon was a perpetual curiosity about the how and the why that things work, anything, how it works, and manifest in a 65-year run of contributions to the inventing and reinventing of this field. She observed a purposeful, disciplined willingness to challenge basic notions that even he held dear at the time. A willingness to question and to read up on just about any topic and see connections between that and just about every other topic. And a commitment to maintaining himself physically and emotionally as well as intellectually. And Kate's most recent revelation, she says, was noticing, partly since Vernon got a hearing aid, noticing how consistently and deeply respectful Vernon is in conversation. If Vernon can hear you, he's listening. And he's working to understand your world and why it looks like that to you. And if you can hear him, He's talking to you, and he's working to give you something worth thinking about. So Vernon is extremely thoughtful and precise in the words that he chooses, and I'm sure I'm not the only person that, in that way, he reminds us of Adam Smith, the subject of his talk tonight. So Vernon and Adam as well, those guys over-deliver. You could say something, you could say this about either one of them. His desire to understand the human condition, her chance to improve it in some way. It's a towering, historically beautiful thing. So please join me in welcoming Vernon and to enjoying him presenting his work, Classical Theory of Human Action in Society and Markets, Adam Smith's Models for Social Economy, with Sabiu Inouye and Bart Wilson. Thank you.
All right, can you hear me? Can you see my slides? Okay. My rule on the slides is if I can't read them, you can't read them. And so I use about, where possible, about 40 font. Okay, I want to thank Charles for inviting me. And I want to thank Kate for agreeing to be the chairwoman. And I want to thank Dave for filling in for Kate, who missed her plane, okay? All right, this work is based on, I have two co-authors. The work, Bart Wilson has been a co-author for decades. We worked together and taught together, and so this work is based on our book, Humanomics, largely, and that draws very heavily on Adam Smith's The Theory of Moral Sentiments. And then the other strand of this work is coming from my co-author, Sabiu Inouye, and we're working on the economics of markets. I met Sabiu, let's see, about 3 years ago last July. And he wrote me from Niger, the French colony of Niger. And he said, I think you might be interested in this manuscript. He says, you know what you did with your first market experiments is you rediscovered classical economics. No kidding. I wouldn't ever have put it that way, so I read what he said. He's right. He's dead right. That's exactly what, it's right out of chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations, and I was just too ignorant of that literature, although I had read The Wealth of Nations back in 1950, but apparently I had, maybe I'd been influenced it, but didn't realize it. So he was absolutely correct. So that's the origin of that stuff. Okay, and here's one of the papers with Sabiu is here, and then our book with Bart Wilson, which is the references. Okay, here's the theme. Adam Smith made original contributions to social theory and to market price discovery theory. That's my claim. That's what I believe. And his thinking, his modeling style, I believe, is fresh for today's scholars and students, and so both social and economic theory. In The Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith's model of other regarding social action explains and predicts how and why we get along or not with our neighbors. It's sort of that simple. Propositions, Smith uses very succinctly stated propositions to summarize his thinking and modeling at many places in the book. And he has propositions, and these are general, abstract, general rules and they are abstract in the sense that they don't depend upon particular circumstances. But they're general enough that you can apply them to particular circumstances. And he sees people, of course, as always being very sensitive to particular circumstances. And so there's a proposition, a couple of them, that when applied to trust games, these models outperform the standard utilitarian model by a factor of 2 to 1. And also, these propositions offer predictions in new novel games. Now, I'm not going to go into those because that's what Bart and I are talking about in our book, Humanomics. But moreover, the propositions are clear enough that it kind of tells you how to design the experiment as well as predicts what's going to happen in it, okay? Okay, so people are very other-regarding, yet everyone is strictly self-interested. This is not a contradiction because Smith distinguishes between being interested and acting in a self-interested way, and these are not the same thing. Okay? We tend to learn and to create and follow rules governing self-interested choice. As Adam Smith puts it, he says, we are all strictly self-interested, but you cannot look your neighbor in the face and avow that all your decisions are going to be based upon your self-interest. And so what you learn to do is to follow rules that modify your self-interest so that you can get along with your neighbors. He uses the phrase get along with 41 times, about every 7 or 8 pages. He wants you to get it. That's what it's about. It's not about utility. Everyone is strictly self-interested. In fact, if they're not, you've got a problem on applying the rules. So the common knowledge of being self-interest has to be widespread. Okay, so we learn to create and follow rules governing self-interested choice based upon his notion of self-command. And he says, when we first have playfellows, it's around school age, he says that's when we enter the great school of self-command, because our playfellows are not as indulgent as our parents when we are angry and do things they don't like, and they make sure we understand that. And so we start to learn this. And self-command fails, of course, whenever your action is selfish. All right. Okay. Then so that's the first part of my talk. Second part is about market price discovery theory. Now, in The Wealth of Nations, Smith models price formation from the perspective and experience of buyers and sellers in the market. His model of supply and demand differs from that of neoclassical theory, but conforms very nicely to modern game theory models of auctions. Okay? And indeed, and his model also predicted patterns that I observed in the first market experiments that I did 180 years later in my first experiment. And this is what Sabiu, you see, was teaching me about from the wilds of Niger. Now, Smith's methodology in both The Wealth of Nations and the Theory of Moral Sentiments begins first with the roots or origins of action. And these are in feelings, experience, and kind of learning to know how to act. Reason in terms of practical learning to know how to act. Then he inquires as to the consequences of actions for society and economy. These are separate. These are not bound together. He does not propose to choose A over B if and only if the utility of A is greater than the utility of B. Okay, in fact, his model challenges the only if part of that, because here's a non-utilitarian model that falsifies the only if part of that. So this utility calculus, see, Wells' origins to consequences. Because, why do we make the decisions we do? It's because of the consequences, and they have utility. So if you take that approach, the if and only if part, then you're just locked into that, okay? And that's one of the things that makes Smith fresh, okay? All right, begin with social theory. Smith says there are two pillars of society: beneficence and justice. Beneficence, that's about the good things we do for each other, okay? And underlying those propositions on beneficence, he gets positive reciprocity, okay, in society. It also gives you trade and economy, except when Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, he didn't point this out because he makes no reference back to his first book. You see, you never cite yourself. That's bad form. That's what vain people do. Okay, so he's following the protocols of the time. But there's a lot of the language in The Wealth of Nations that you recognize. If you've read The Theory of Moral Sentiments, you recognize his choice of words, okay? Like he says, every man, so long as he does not violate the laws of justice, is perfectly free to pursue his own interests in his own way. Notice every one of those words are important. You see, and of course people read that and they say, oh, hey, this is the guy, this champion of the self-interest. Everybody is self-interested in that and they act in that. Nothing can be further from the truth. Okay, so now justice is about the control of the hurtful actions that we do to each other through punishment. Okay, our impulse is to punish people who do things that are hurtful to us. And that really, and trust games kind of are really a nice way of illustrating how people behave in trust games, illustrates, I think, these bottom-up roots of sociality and Smith's concept of self-command, because the subjects in these experiments are completely free to act in a self-interested way. And I once had someone criticized our instructions in the trust games. He says, you're basically telling them that they can take all the money if they want to. Well, yeah, that's the point. We want them to feel free to do that. He got it. Okay. So, all right, now in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, justice means one thing and one thing only, and that's security from injury. You see, distributional justice is a contradiction of terms. Smith would say, distribution, that's okay, we can talk about that, but that's beneficence. That's about beneficence, not about justice. Justice is about the control of the bad things. Okay, and so justice implies security from injury, and that means tolerable security from murder, theft, robbery, and violation of contract. Okay? And if we're reasonably secure in that, then we can pursue our lives fairly well. But notice that defines property. Okay? If we have laws keeping people neighbors from murdering me or stealing from me or violating contracts, then that's exactly what we mean by property. So property comes out of the Theory of Moral Sentiments. Now, in The Wealth of Nations, justice as law, okay, secures from injury from three sources: government, neighbors, and foreigners. The U.S. Constitution, what is it about? It's about protection of citizens from their government. It's what it's all about. And if you're protected from your government, then you got a chance to have a government that will protect you from your neighbors if they do hurtful things, and protect you from invasion by foreigners. So that's kind of the way it works in the Wealth of Nations. Okay, here's what we call beneficence proposition 1. Smith doesn't name them, he just states them, okay? And he says, actions of a beneficent tendency which proceed from proper motives, and that basically means intentional, but it's pretty rich. There's a lot to be said about that. Seem alone to require reward, because such alone are the approved objects of gratitude. So, it's Monday morning. You're going to the office. Before you go to the office, you take your trash barrel and put it out at the curb, because this is trash barrel pickup day. You come home at night, your mind is on the day's activities, and you forget to bring it in. Your neighbor is out bringing in her trash barrel, and she notices that you didn't bring yours in. So she brings it in, puts it behind your gate. Okay? Well, the following weekend, you're in the backyard picking avocados, and you pick an extra half dozen, put them in a sack, and take them over to your neighbor. She's not at home, but you leave them on the doorstep. She'll know where they came from. Okay? That's an illustration of this proposition. Notice there's a lot of common information in that. What's trash pickup day? Also, the street sweeper comes through early Tuesday morning. You don't want to leave your barrel out you get a ticket, you get a citation. So she's protecting you from that. So there's a lot of common knowledge, and she knows I like avocados. I know that she likes avocados. She knows I'm giving up something that I like when I give them to her. She and I both know that nobody likes to be wheeling wheelbarrows around, okay, or trash barrels. So she's saving me. So there's a lot of information in that. Now, in Adam Smith's time, I don't think we hear it so much now, people spoke of a debt of gratitude. And he points this out. This is an example as to why this proposition is embedded in the language and in people. People talk about the debt of gratitude. Today, we're more likely to say, I owe you one. Why do you say I owe you one? Well, Smith says you feel gratitude, okay, and you're responding to that. Okay, and then Justice Proposition 1, that's the obverse of this beneficence proposition. He says, actions of a hurtful tendency which proceed from improper motives seem alone to deserve punishment, because such alone are the approved objects of resentment. Now, Smith makes the point, with respect to both, but particularly with the beneficence propositions, he said the important thing about this situation is that you feel obligated, you see, to exhaust that debt of gratitude. Your neighbor or your good friend may get promoted. You feel good about that, but the agency came from someone else. You can feel good about things that happen to your friends, and you don't have to be the agent of that action. But he says he's talking about stuff here where you feel you have to be the agent. See, nobody else can satisfy your debt except you. Okay, of these two pillars, justice is the more essential. He says society cannot subsist among those who are at all times ready to hurt and injure one another. Beneficence, therefore, is less essential to the existence of society than justice. But you know, notice that both pillars require common knowledge that all are self-interested. For otherwise, we don't know what is benefit or hurt, reward, punishment. All of those things have to have suggest, you see, that we have common knowledge that all are self-interested. And you see this in the standard trust game. Everybody looks at this game and analyzes it in the same way. If player 1 passes to 2 and 2 plays down, that hurts 1 and benefits 2. There isn't anybody that doesn't sort of get that. Okay? So implicitly, we all have common knowledge that all are self-interested. We have different views as to how people play the game, but we don't have a different perspective on kind of this sort of analysis. And okay, now here's this standard trust game. Kevin McCabe and I did some of these games as early as, I think, 33 years ago, 32 or 3 years ago. And results the same today as they were then. Okay. The twos that get an opportunity to play, and that's 27 of the 49, predominantly move right by 2 to 1. They move right rather than defect. Now you get somewhat less than 2/3 of the ones passing to twos, but that's understandable. They have no idea what kind of person they're paired with. Okay, whereas twos know who they're paired with, the kind of person who will pass to them. Okay, and now ones, notice they're under absolutely no obligation to pass 2. They're perfectly free to move right and stop the game and take $12. So if they pass the 2, there's something going on. Okay, and it certainly looks deliberate. They're doing what they didn't have to do. And look at the possibilities they're opening up for 2. Okay. Okay, and then here's Justice Proposition 1, which is consistent with the punishment of defection. And so you take that basic game and you just add another node so that if 2 defects, play passes back to 1, and 1 chooses between the defection outcome, right, or at one at a cost of $2, she can really punish whoever it was, this 2 guy, for playing down, you see, because for $2 she can hit him with a $38 penalty. Well, do people use punishment? Yeah. Here, their ones are 24% of them, you see, are punishing that. Now you might ask, why aren't more people punishing at that low cost? Why aren't they really unloading on this defection? Smith's got propositions for that. We tend to, the impartial spectator is above all fair. And he's got propositions on, we want the punishment to fit the crime. Punishment should be neither too high or too low. So one possibility, and you can see how these propositions open up this game for further examination by varying these payoffs, you see. Okay, so trust games in which individuals do not choose best for themselves collectively do best for all. And secondly, costly options are invoked to punish, that is, deter acts of injustice. So these rules that we fashion and follow increase social betterment. Now Smith, though, has more to say about the use of punishment to deter injustice. He says that's primarily what strong central governments do, is to introduce rules that try to deter bad actions by these punishments. He says in the history of jurisprudence, prudence. Earlier, in periods when governments are less centralized and weaker, they use other procedures. And one of them is victim compensation. You punish the perpetrator and the punishment extracts something, and it's used to help make the victim whole. So your son murders my son. The authorities catch your son. What do they do with him? They bring him to me as head of the family and the family. And we decide what to do. And we don't necessarily put him down. Too late for that. That's not going to bring my son back. And now it's true that deters people in the future, but that's in the future. How about me? So there was a tendency just to do victim cost. So your son might have to work for me. Or if you've got assets, then there's might be a transfer of land, of valuables, you see, to compensate me. So now notice in the theory of moral sentiments that justice proposition 1 is the origin of property. The resentment of intentionally hurtful actions in close-knit communities is the origin of the civil order of law and of punishment proportioned to resentment. And the resentment is proportioned to the infraction, okay? So he says the violation of justice is injury, real and positive hurt to persons from motives naturally disapproved of, and that means a community. Third parties all agree on that. You see, it isn't just between me and the guy who's hurt me. And as the greater and more irreparable the evil that is done, the resentment of the sufferers runs naturally the higher. Now, Smith combines this proposition with another proposition, which is, and this is the fundamental asymmetry between gains and losses. He derives that from a more fundamental asymmetry between our joy and our sorrow. Okay? And he states that very succinctly. He says we suffer more when we fall from a better to a worse situation than we ever gain when we rise from a worse to a better. Now, he uses that to explain why theft and robbery are penalized more heavily than violation of contract. So someone steals $5,000 from you, or alternatively, there's a violation of contract and you lose $5,000. These don't command the same penalties. He says, to be deprived of that which we are possessed of is a greater evil than to be disappointed of what we only have the expectation. Breach of property, therefore, theft and robbery, which take from us what we are possessed of, are greater crimes than breach of contract, which only disappoints us of this gain that we had expected. So he says, the most sacred laws of justice, therefore, those whose variation seems to call loudest for vengeance and punishment, are the laws which guard the life and person of our neighbor. The next are those which guard his property and possessions, and last of all come those which guard what we are called his personal rights, okay, or what is due him from the promises of others. And indeed, of course, today, and for a really long time, violation of property is criminal. Violation of contract is only a civil infraction. They didn't get O.J. Simpson under criminal act, but they got him under the civil, okay? So, in TMS, Theory of Moral Sentiments, Smith first models the roots and origins of actions, and those are in feelings, experience, and reason in the sense of learning to know how. Okay, learning know-how. And then he examines the consequences of action. For example, that theft and robbery are greater infractions of justice than violation of contract. Now, in the Wealth of Nations, a basic theorem is that wealth is created by specialization, and that in turn is determined by the extent of markets. That's the kind of the outstanding two-pronged theorem that comes out of the wealth of nations. So, hence, Smith models price formation as emerging from the decentralized interaction of the collective of buyers and sellers in a market. So he wants to go to the roots of all of that and ask how it is that price forms in markets. Okay, now I'm going to, let's go into the price discovery, which is mostly chapter 7 of book 1, The Wealth of Nations. And this is consistent with the equilibrium convergence I observed in first market experiments, and I'll show you some of those old experiments. But let me first say, in demand theory, when consumers arrive in markets, how do we, as theorists, express their demand? Well, there's been 3 perspectives. First is the general equilibrium perspective, where people are imagined doing a homework exercise in which they're maximizing utility, conditional on given prices, and subject to the income constraint. Okay, that allows you to specify the amounts you would buy as a function of these hypothetical prices. But notice that's a very passive exercise. This basically led, I think, with the neoclassicals to the idea that there had to be a sea of buyers and sellers, so many that you no way in which you can have any effect on the price. Otherwise, you're not a pure price taker, you see. So you had this stuff about there had to be large numbers. And Jevons believed you had to have complete perfect information on supply and demand. It wasn't just enough to know your own demand or your own supply. Well, you had to know everybody's. So this is the kind of world that, that I was educated in when I did my first experiment. Now, Marshall, he was a utilitarian, and he kind of followed the same mathematics, but read his beautiful half dozen pages or so on price formation in a country corn market. It's very nice. And it's based entirely on book 1, chapter 7 of The Wealth of Nations. It has nothing to do with marginal utility or any of the stuff that he's talking about. Buyers come to market with a distribution function of values. Okay, so it's really V is a function of Q, but then he doesn't write it that way. He puts price in for V, which is of course a mistake. The values merely bound the potential prices. So, but that's the way he presented the demand. Now, Bill Vickery, auction theory, 1961. How does he model auctions? Well, Q buyers bring to market a distribution function of maximum willingness to pay. Okay, and you see that in an English auction. As the prices are bid up, the fewer and fewer bidders, they're dropping out. So now, the classical economists, interestingly, represent market agents as in auction theory. They really have that, I think, pretty clearly in mind, although they have none of the language of distribution theory, okay? So the commodity space is discrete. Transactions involve single units or batches of goods. Think of your shopping basket. It's got a quart of milk, a pound of bacon, a jar of olives, and a box of cereal. Your neighbor's basket has got a half gallon of milk, okay, and a pound of bacon and a jar of olives, and he has a large box of Wheaties, and you have a small one. Okay, notice what the market is doing. The market's convenient package items to help us solve our inventory problem. So depending upon how often you shop, how many are in your family, how big your kitchen pantry is, okay, you may buy stuff in small or large units. and the market has been in a very sophisticated way, has adapted to that, see? So all we have to do is think in terms of what we're willing to pay for a medium-sized box of cereal, cornflakes or Wheaties, okay? You not only have small, medium, and large, but now you have super packs for families for some of the popular items like cornflakes and Wheaties. So anyway, let me drop down here. Buyers and sellers, you see, in Smith's way of thinking, are represented by simple buy cheap, sell dear, higgling and bargaining strategies with demand supply defined as limits to their willingness to pay, a limit amount you're willing to pay based on this maximum willingness to pay, or a minimum that you'll require as a seller. And it's, I think, important to understand that Smith knew about auctions. Now, there's no place in any of his writings where you can go and he'll tell you about auctions or model them or anything like that. But he makes side comments that are scattered through his work on auctions. It makes it very clear that he understood those. He was illustrating the effect of scarcity on price, and he uses an example, the report of the traveler in the Arabian desert that paid 10,000 crowns for a single cruise of water. And Smith says, it's much like in auctions. And then he says, if two buyers equally desire an item, the one with the larger wealth would carry it. Now notice, he understands that the high bidder wins, okay? He understands that taste and wealth both matter, okay? And I think it doesn't take much of a step to think and to see him as thinking about two-sided supply and demand markets in exactly the same way, okay? And if you read, I think, his writing on that, it does indeed seem to be exactly that. Well, here's my first experiment, January 1956. And here's chart one. I put the supply and demand chart on the left, and I make Marshall's error. I put price on the vertical axis. There's no price there. That's a negative distribution function of values for the demand, and that's a positive distribution function of supply costs for the supply. So there's no price over there. Price is over here on the right because people are trading by oral outcry, bid-ask, double auction rules. And also you can see that there must be, in that first period, there's a lot of conversions take place just in the bid-ask space before there's a first contract, which is actually, the first contract is not all that far from the equilibrium. So these undergraduates don't have any much trouble here finding the equilibrium. Notice here in this. Oh, the market is the supply and demand is refreshed each period. So period one is like Monday, and the market trades out. And then everyone comes to market on Tuesday and with a refreshed desire to buy or sell. So we're using Marshall's notion of a flow of goods onto the market, and then consumers take it off, so over time. So there's and I thought if people had any chance of getting it right in these experiments, they would have to have some experience, and so I did this replication, which was very much a Marshallian sort of concept. Now, What was my reaction to this experiment in 1956? It's very simple. There had to be something wrong with it. I mean, our theory here has got a lot of moving parts, and it's very sophisticated. You're going to tell me that a bunch of sophomores walk into the room, you give half of them values and half of them cost, and explain to them how you trade by the two-sided doctrine? They're going to find the equilibrium? No. So something wrong with the experiment. What's wrong with the experiment? Well, there's too much symmetry. Demand is just a mirror image of supply. The clearing price is the average value and the average cost. So I thought that's it. So I did this experiment. And all the 12 or so experiments that I reported in that 1962 paper is I'm trying to figure out what this animal is that's emerged in the laboratory. Because there's no one going to believe who had training. I went to Harvard, almost went to MIT, but after tuition I got a better deal at Harvard. But it wouldn't have made any difference. It wouldn't have made a bit of difference. You go to Yale or Princeton, everybody was coming out and they had these beliefs, you see. And what I was finding out that these beliefs were false. This doesn't work. Now, of course, people had all kinds of ways of dodging the heat here. As one of my reviewers at the JPE, when I sent the paper in, said, he says, what a bunch of undergraduates did at Purdue University has nothing to do with the real world. There it is. And you still hear that too. I don't know what people are talking about, the real world it is, but it's apparently these Department of Commerce statistics or something. But anyway, here's a more recent experiment. These are high school students. We do workshops regularly for high school students, and we always put them through a double auction supply and demand experiment. And the instructor here, it's an oral outcry auction. The instructor is typing into the computer the bids and asks as people announce them and the contracts, so that people see on this screen up here as they're trading, shouting out their bids and asks, and they're seeing this up here on the screen. So the bids are rising, the blue, and the asks are tending to fall until there's a contract, and so on. So, these are 6 buyers, 6 sellers. They each have a capacity to trade 4 units. And then, since it's a teaching exercise, we superimpose the supply and demand on these things, and so people can see what the rest of the supply or demand looks besides their own. Okay, let's now go back. Let's actually look at chapter 7. Smith says that goods have utility value in use and value in exchange. That's the price. Okay. Use value he measured by maximum willingness to pay. He called them reservation prices or reservation values, or what he called effectual demand. A poor man might like a carriage in 6, but he can't begin to pay for it, so that's useless. So we're talking about desire for things backed up with purchasing power. And what does he say on page 58 and 59? He describes the dynamics of a market. He says, if the quantity brought to the market falls short of effectual demand, those willing to pay the supply price cannot be supplied, and some will bid for what they can get, and the price will increase. So if there's too little brought to market, price tends to rise, and moreover, purchases down there at those prices are limited by supply. People can't buy more than is available in the market. And similarly, if the quantity brought exceeds demand, it's high, it cannot be sold to buyers willing to pay the supply price, and price falls. And up there, sales is limited by demand. You can't sell more than people are willing to buy. So we have what Sabu and I call short side rationing, always happening in a market at these non-equilibrium prices. So that's the so this is a two-part theory. One is the price change has the same sign as excess demand, and then the other is that quantity is rationed by either supply or demand, whichever is in short supply. Now, I'm sorry, it gets a little bit harder to read. I should have broke this, I guess, into two parts. But the motivation here is that buyers and sellers have come to market with these maximum willingness to pay values, or V. The V's, and the sellers have minimum costs that they expect to be, the offer prices that they're going to require be met. And as in the experiments, the V's and the C's here replenish in a series of periods. So we have period 1, period 2, 3, okay. Okay, the price adjustment rule is that the price change and excess demand have the same sign. So that means that EFP to PDT here is positive, where T is a transaction, and we're thinking of those transactions in period 1, there's a series of transactions, then we go on to period 2, and there's another series, and so forth, and the transactions go on and on. Okay, now, it's interesting. Now, if you write this for discrete, V of P for discrete values and costs, you see what you're doing is summing over for any given price, you're summing over all those values that are at least as great as price, and you're summing over those costs, which are at least covered, you see, by the price. So you're summing over only profitable contracts. So V here then is simply the distance between a given price and the trader's evaluations, okay? So it's a measure in profit space of the distance of price from the trader's valuations and costs. So that's the way that this V of P gives you measures in profit space this distance. And then we have short side rationing principle. So Q, the quantity actually traded, is the min of supply and demand. And then if we write the expression for total surplus, and that is the surplus that people actually realize, and that's of course subject to this short side rationing. We see now that V here, you see, is this distance measure is a Lipinov function, and that prices, transaction prices tend to move until they become stationary. And the market may not clear. I mean, suppose the supply is perfectly elastic, a constant cost industry. Then the quantity produced is determined where demand cuts that. So we can have excess supply or excess demand even though the market is stationary. So this generalizes the market clearing. P star here, we call that the center of market value. It minimizes this distance, V of P. It maximizes surplus, actually it's captured by the buyers and sellers, and it maximizes trade, okay? So we call this the principle of maximum information, that the market price evolves so as to reflect values better and better. And these prices, you see, these prices are publicizing information which was secret before. was in the heads of buyers and sellers. Whenever there's a price, we're getting that information revealed. Well, that can be important if you're an innovator, because the price tells you what real people are willing to trade at, and you've got an idea for doing it a whole lot cheaper. Okay, so that you can act on that information. So this is kind of, we see this as the classic foundations of the later work that Haidt did, emphasizing the pricing system as an information system, and the Hurwitz, Ryder, Radnor stuff on informational efficiency. And also we're going to use Shannon to formalize the information content here. But first, here's illustrations. In the upper right diagram, we have an exponential distribution of values in demand, an exponential increase distribution of costs. And so there's the values and costs plotted. And then if the price is below this P star, we see that demand is limited by supply. If it's too high, supply is limited by demand. So the solid curve there is giving you the short side rationing. Over here on the right, we have the V of P function. This is a large market, very large, and so we can approximate it with continuous functions. So here's the V of P function, reach a minimum of P star, and then their overall surplus captured is maximized there. And then over time, these prices are converging. And it's in the series of periods, 1, 2, so that people get this chance to learn across time. Okay, here's the information theory from Shannon. Now notice that a transaction concluded at a price P reveals publicly the evidence of a cost C no greater than P and a value V no smaller than P that are private information. So the conjunction of those two events, we have V here measuring resource value added and C measuring resource value forgone as a result of that trade. So the trade informatively signals this net increase in gain or this net gain for society. Now Shannon proposed to measure the information in an event realization by log probability of the event. So the change in information, if I of P is the information function, for a smooth large market, the change in information will just be the log of D of P over S of P, because that gives you the high-valued demand amounts in the numerator, and below you have the low-cost supply amounts up to P. So that's the overlap, you see, and that's the information in that supply and demand terms. So the change in transaction information with a change P is non-negative. See, we get di dt, just as we had dv dt is non-positive, this is non-negative, okay? So we get, over time, what we're getting as transactions take place, that distance between price and the trader's valuations is getting smaller, and the information of yield is getting larger. So let's illustrate that with a particular model. See, this is all so far parameter free, but in an institution we specify in detail how it is that buyers and sellers get together and trade. There's a lot of rules that govern that. So take the multiple unit English auction for Q equal to 4. Well, there's the representation of demand and supply up here, over here on the upper left. The way Bill Vickery visualized a multiple unit auction as operating is that as soon as you have a first bid on the floor, suppose it's 20. Okay, we got 4 units offered, so you got have to have 3 people match that bid before anyone can raise it. And then they raise it, and then you get 3 more matches. Then someone can raise it, and it marches up until it gets into the P star set. Okay, and that diagram on the right shows those things going up until they hit the equilibrium set. And then down here on the left, notice now the V of P function is piecewise linear, so it has these flat segments. And as you see, it reaches a minimum at this P star, and the information function is piecewise linear, and it reaches a maximum. Information is getting better and better. Okay, so markets with private information in which people try only to do best for themselves, collectively do best for all, and that's the basic result in the wealth of nations. And that means that V of P is minimized at P star, and the information content is maximized at P star. So here's a summary. And the main point here is that Smith is distinguishing between being self-interested and choosing actions that are self-interested, and that's what really kind of drives what goes on in the theory of moral sentiments. And in his second book, he nicely predicts what I discovered, you see, beginning in 1956. Okay, except I didn't know that he had done that so nicely. But I've been busy trying to correct that error. So, and both models distinguish between the roots of action and the consequences of action. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And here's, don't read what we wrote. Read the Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations. You can download them free. Here they are. Click on that and download it, and you'll get copies that can be searched. And get it from him, not secondary sources like the rest of us. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
You game for questions? You want some questions, Vernon?
Sure.
Well,
Yeah, I might not be able to answer them, but I'm happy to listen to the questions and find out what I've done wrong.
a question of clarification from, say it's from Kate, that you say the distance between price and value decreases with competition.
I'm sorry, what?
The distance between price and value decreases with competition? You said that.
Well, entry, you see, his model of competition is essentially the contestable market stuff. That was a large literature on it when people discovered that airlines, because they could shift planes from one route to another, had a disciplining effect, even if there's only one airline serving A and B. The fact that if the guy tries to raise the price, people can go in, made those markets contestable. So there's a literature on that, and that's exactly Smith's model. He emphasized competition from sellers. It was just as important that buyers compete. But you see, he's worried more about sellers because of all of the mercantilists. These guys, you see, governments that wanted to do nice things for their friends in private industry. And so because he was very concerned about the mercantilist interventions in the markets, I think that's why he tended to emphasize sellers rather than buyers, even though in the market he's talking about both, and both have to be able to have free entry into that pricing process.
Okay, thank you. So I was assuming maybe something like a regular oral auction, that competition among the buyers would cause the distance to decrease in a straightforward way, but would you say it the same way if it's the sellers who are competing? Let's say the sellers competing, I would have said that would decrease the distance between price and reservation value, or something like that, or reservation price, or cost
Yeah.
of production, or something.
Okay, yeah. Yeah,
Okay,
I'm having trouble. What? My
well,
batteries or something. I put new batteries in these, but they're failing. Anyway, good luck.
Well, all right,
Let's try to.
Yeah, I guess what I'm learning is if you can keep your mouth as close to the microphone as possible,
Okay.
that helps. Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. So the floor is open. Kevin?
So for theory of moral sentiments, do you know, in your reading, did Adam Smith discuss what happens when both parties feel they've been wrong? That is, there's resentment on both sides. So there's no sense that one person was right and one person was wrong. Is that a situation where third parties are necessary, and is it arbitrary?
I don't know that he goes much into that, but the point is, but one of his main points is you see that things escalate. Negative reciprocity is unbounded. It escalates out of control. You never have that problem with positive reciprocity. That's always bounded, okay? But it's unbounded from the downside, and that's what makes it so justice so important, and to get control of that, because you can't even, a society cannot even get off the ground with any kind of civil liberties if you don't have hurtful actions brought under control. And that's his point about why it's so much more important to have justice than beneficence.
Vernon, you talked about Claude Shannon's theory of information and defining this information as like probability. I couldn't figure out what insight we were supposed to get out of your defining things this way. Can you say more about what's added by this information theory?
Well, what's added? I don't know. I think it's a way of kind of formalizing the kind of stuff that Leo Hurwitz and my colleagues Stan Ryder and Roy Radner were doing on the informational efficiency of markets, because Claude Shannon had this way of representing, measuring information that had a natural intuitive appeal, because information is in the form of probability distributions, and then we get an event realization, and that's when you see that the measured information needs to be in the form of these, in terms of the realization of these hidden events. Okay.
Are there interesting comparative statics across markets on information?
Sabu and I have only been working 2.5 years. There's lots of, there's lots of stuff. It's join the fray. This is just a work in process, and we don't have. It has, I'm sure, all kinds of implications that are worth exploring, that we haven't begun yet even to think about.
Okay, who else wants to join the fray?
So David, come join us. I was talking about David Riley over here, David, not David.
One way that might be interesting is in the fragmentation of markets, right? Because the Lipinov function that you're defining, that what would that look like if markets were fragmented? I think that would be a very interesting question.
Yeah.
Further questions? maybe I could ask, so there's this, as you know, there's this famous kind of puzzle in philosophy, and it's kind of a cheap puzzle. But I think you have a way of actually making it interesting. So they'll say, okay, we've got this guy who produced 2 wonderful books, each of them like a gem in and of itself. And the one book says it's all about self-interest, and the other book says it's all about sympathy. And so they say, this guy must have been schizophrenic. But you have a theory.
Well, it's all about sympathy among people that are strictly self-interested and want to get along with their neighbors. You know, that model makes a lot of sense to anyone walking around out there on the street. I mean, you know, it's what people do. And the propositions are pulling that together. It is incredibly insightful. I mean, can you imagine the stuff we're writing today that people are still interested 200 years later?
This is pretty amazing.
Huh? And he was kind of a recluse himself in a lot of ways. He had friends that were very close and very, very dear to him. You know, David Hume was a very close friend and was to have been executor of his estate. But the problem is that David died. He died in 1776, the year he published The Wealth of Nations. And so then, and his instruction to David Hume was burn everything. burn all the letter. Burn everything in my files because it's not ready to go out there. Smith had this idea that, you know, if he polished and was very careful what he said, that people would understand it. He didn't understand how the world works, you know. No, people haven't done that, and he might as well left everything because it would have been certainly not distorted any more than the stuff that he did publish. See.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So you might say if you're self-interested, you don't want to make enemies. That's
right.
That's not a
right.
contradiction. So yeah, I mean a lot of what
Yeah, and you see, if someone does something hurtful, that deserves punishment. But you may decide not to punish. And it may be in a situation where you fear escalation. And you just don't want to. He says, I think it's very important. He uses the word deserve with the justice proposition, the word require with the beneficence proposition. He never tells us why he does that, but I think you can figure it out. For one thing, with justice, the errors, I mean, you put an innocent man in jail, okay, that's pretty serious. I mean, someone did me a good turn and he didn't intend to, and I thought it was intentional, so I returned the favor. So what's the big deal? You see, I think because he discusses those errors, and I think that may have been, what he had in mind.
Isn't that interesting? I never had this thought before, but I'm thinking if you've got a system of justice that doesn't try hard enough to make sure that it avoids convicting innocent people, it's the whole system that's making enemies.
Well, Smith used English language very carefully. You know, he wrote a review of the first English dictionary. And one of the few people around was competent to write a review of it. So I think, and I would say I know the first 120 pages of the Theory of Moral Sentiments far better than I do the rest. So I still got a lot to dig out of this.
Well, thank you so much.
Okay.
What an honor to